Amy Duncan Archer Gilligan went down in history as one of the most brutal serial killers of the early 20th century. Her crimes went unnoticed for many years because she skillfully hid behind the mask of a caring boarding house owner. But how was she able to kill for so long without arousing suspicion? Let's take a closer look at her story. Amy Duncan was born in 1868 in Milton, Connecticut, to a large farming family. In her youth, she attended a convent school where she was brought up in a strict manner. In 1897, she married Michael Gilligan, but their union was short-lived. The story of his life and death remains a mystery, since there is virtually no official information about him. Sometime later, she married again to James Archer, and with him in 1907, she founded a boarding house in Windsor, Connecticut. They called it Archer House. The idea of a boarding house was popular at the time. Elderly and disabled people could transfer their savings or property in exchange for lifelong care. However, the boarding house soon became a place from which no one left alive. In 1910, her husband James Archer died unexpectedly. Doctors determined uremic edema as the cause of death, but the odd thing was that Amy had purchased a large insurance policy in his name a few months earlier. Left a widow, she continued to run the boarding house alone, and during this time, numerous mysterious deaths began to occur. Elderly people would move into the boarding house, signing a contract to hand over their property or money in exchange for lifelong care. They would soon begin to complain of feeling unwell. Within a few months or weeks, they would die of natural causes. Amy would take the money, and the body would be buried without a thorough investigation. Amy would soon begin buying large quantities of arsenic and strychnine, citing rodent control. But why did no one suspect her? At the time, the deaths of elderly people were seen as natural, and the police did not conduct full investigations. The first warning signs began to ring when relatives of the deceased began to notice a repeating pattern of deaths. In 1914, Franklin Andrews entered the boarding house. He was an active and healthy man, but died suddenly just a month later. Before he died, he signed papers leaving all of his property to Amy. His sister, Nellie Pierce, became suspicious. She decided to check the records and discovered that over the past 5 years, more than 60 people had died in the boarding house. Almost all of them left their property to the owner before they died. She wrote a letter to the Hartford Courant, detailing her suspicions. The newspaper began an investigation and found that Amy was constantly buying poison from a drugstore, and her income significantly exceeded the costs of running the boarding house. Soon the police launched an investigation and exhumed several bodies of deceased lodgers. The bodies were found to contain lethal doses of arsenic and strychnine. All the victims died from poisoning. In 1917, Amy was arrested and charged with the murder of 5 people, despite the fact that more than 60 victims were suspected. At the trial, she acted coolly, claiming that she was being unfairly accused. However, the evidence was overwhelming. In 1919, the court sentenced her to death. However, after an appeal, the sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. In 1924, Amy was declared mentally ill and transferred to a mental hospital, where she spent the rest of her life. She died in 1962 at the age of 94. Why wasn't she caught earlier? In those days, old people often died of natural causes, and no one checked the causes. Amy seemed like a caring and pious woman, which inspired confidence. Many bodies were buried without an autopsy, which made it difficult to detect poison. Legacy. cultural impact. Amy's story inspired Joseph Kasori to create the play Arsenic and Old Lace, which was later adapted into a film starring Cary Grant. But unlike the comedy version of the story, Amy's real crimes were horrific. She killed in cold blood for money, and her victims were gullible old people whom she promised to care for. An American serial killer who committed 11 murders of women in the Detroit area between the fall of 1991 and the summer of 1990. To most of Atkins' victims were involved in prostitution and drug addiction. Atkins was subsequently convicted and sentenced to several terms of life imprisonment. Atkins committed most of his murders in the neighborhoods and suburban communities along Detroit's main thoroughfare, Woodward Avenue, informally known as the Woodward Corridor, which earned him the nickname the Woodward Corridor Killer. Benjamin Atkins was born into a poor family in Detroit. His childhood was difficult. He grew up without a father, and his mother was a drug addict and a sex worker. At the age of 10, he became a victim of sexual abuse by a man who came to his mother. Benjamin Atkins left home in the late 1980s, after which he began to lead a vagabond lifestyle and get involved in drugs, as a result of which he developed a drug addiction. Due to the lack of education, he was forced to do low-skilled labor with low pay and spend the night in homeless shelters. During this period, he began to spend a lot of his free time in the company of prostitutes and pimps. Despite this, he was not noticed in committing serious offenses and was not prosecuted. Most of his acquaintances spoke highly of him, but at the same time noted that when under the influence of alcohol and drugs, Atkins showed signs of antisocial behavior and misogyny. Due to constant stress, he developed a personality disorder and began to hate women, especially sex workers. Benjamin began his first killing spree in December 1991. In just 9 months, he killed 11 women, making him one of the fastest serial killers in U.S. history. The first victim was discovered on December 14, 1991, and was identified as 30-year-old Debbie Ann Friday, who had been missing since December 8th. A few days later, on December 30th of that year, the body of 26-year-old Bertha Jean Mason, who had been missing since December 11th of that year after leaving her home to go shopping, was discovered on February 17th, 1992. 3 bodies were found in 3 rooms of an abandoned former Monterey motel and were later identified as 34-year-old prostitute Valerie Chalk and 23-year-old Juania Hardy. The body of the third victim has not been identified. All the victims found had been raped multiple times before their deaths, including in a perverted form, and then strangled. Valerie Chalk's relatives told police that the girl had been declared missing in early November 1991 after she went missing on April 9, 1992. The body of 28-year-old Brenda Mitchell, who had gone missing on April 5th of the year after leaving the house with her 2 children to go shopping, was found in an abandoned house. Mitchell's body was found almost completely naked, except for a scarf around her neck. A forensic examination revealed that Brenda Mitchell had taken a lethal dose of drugs before her death, which is why her death was initially ruled a drug overdose. A few days later, on April 15th of that year, the partially decomposed body of 27-year-old Vicki Beasley Brown, who had last been seen alive on March 25th, was found on June 15th, 1992. The body of 45-year-old Joanna Rourke was discovered making her the serial killer's 10th victim. He lured women with promises of money or drugs. He took them to abandoned Detroit buildings. He raped and strangled them, either with his hands or with a rag or belt. He left the bodies to rot in the same buildings, where they were found weeks or months later. Atkins killed women between the ages of 30 and 42. Most of them were sex workers or drug addicts. In August 1992, one surviving victim managed to escape and told police about the attack. She described Atkins, and the police began searching for him. He was arrested on August 21st, 1992. When questioned, he confessed to 11 murders. Atkins said he hated sex workers and killed them because he saw them as his mother. The trial opened in January 1994. There were 150 prosecution witnesses, including relatives of several of Atkins' victims. At one of the hearings, Atkins confessed to the murders, but pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. Atkins was in a mental state for much of the trial, unresponsive and seemingly withdrawn. His attorney argued for leniency on the grounds that Atkins had been abused as a child. The attorney argued that the trauma, coupled with his drug addiction, have led to his mental, emotional, and behavioral problems. However, after a 4-month trial and 3 days of deliberations, the jury found Benjamin Atkins guilty of the charges against him, and in April 1994, he was sentenced to several terms of life imprisonment.